All right, so my presentation is on Russia in the post-Cold War era, and I'm focusing on the challenges that the government has posed in terms of the economy. So here's just a map, basic map of Russia, and really just what I wanted to get the point across was that most of the population, as you can see, the density of cities is actually in the west, as opposed to the east. And I'll get back to the reason why that's significant later on. So governmental problems, just as a basic outline, the lack of government change from the Soviet era to now has been a significant barrier for economic growth. And I'll elaborate more on that later, but just the basic idea of really when the government changed from the Soviet Union to Russia, a lot of the institutions, a lot of the corporations didn't fundamentally change as the country had in name. And also poor decision making in the government. That comes on part of two things. One, inept policymakers, and the second is really just others lobbying for things that are in their own interest. And then corruption. Corruption is a huge, huge issue in Russia, both in companies and in the government. And then nationalization of industries, really just, that's a more recent thing, and I'll just talk about that right now. Just an overall trend, especially under Vladimir Putin, of the government nationalizing industries, which in turn has really led to a lot less competition of companies. And so these are just the leaders, with the exception of one very brief amount of time. Boris Yeltsin, from the start of the Russian Federation to 2000, and then Vladimir Putin until 2008, and then Dmitry Medvedev is the current president. And really what's significant about this is that Vladimir Putin, in theory, is not the president anymore. However, he still is prime minister. He's second in command. And so there's really been a lot of controversy as to whether or not he's actually out of power anymore. And there was issue talking about at the time that Putin perhaps would try to change the constitution to allow a president to take more than 2 terms. However, he decided not to. But instead of actually leaving power, he just went to second in command. So imagine President of the United States, instead of actually leaving, just went to vice president. But really, in this sense, he actually has a lot more power.
So like, if Dick Cheney had been president and then went to being vice president and made all those decisions for George Bush for another 2 terms?
Yeah. Okay, so lack of reform from the Soviet era. In 1992, Boris Yeltsin came up with a lot of reform-minded policies. Some of it was carried out from Gorbachev, and some of it was too liberal for much of the legislators. So they, so those with power quickly really reduced it. One of the ideas was shock therapy, which was immediately getting the industry started up again, immediately pouring money into them, and but that was quickly stopped. Lack of reform meant that the companies continued to practice harmful methods. Sorry. So a lot of the companies had a lot of connections from the Soviet era, and they didn't lose those. There wasn't any fundamental shift. A lot of the same companies continued to carry over from the Soviet Union, which meant that really it didn't allow new companies to form. Negative valued industries. A lot of the companies from the Soviet era, their factories were old, and so they were producing things that were costing more than they were selling for. Yet they continued to do it because they were somewhat state-owned companies, and so they really were just continuing to make things while losing money because that just was what they were used to doing. Monopolies and oligopolies. both are significant, as I talked before, about the fact that new companies really haven't had a chance to form because of these major corporations. Things like Gazprom and other, especially energy corporations, have not allowed new competitors to come in. And they've also been very influential with the government. And then dearth of government transparency has really carried over from the Soviet Union. The government really has not disclosed a lot of facts, figures, and the such about the economy and about whether or not, or about laws such as ones protecting corporations, which has really, I didn't say foreign on here, but really worried foreign investors. And so foreign investors have not poured a lot of money into Russia, and which is vastly different from Poland, which has had a great increase of economy due to a lot of foreign investment. Poor decision making. Many of the decisions made were for personal gains, and so that was one of the things that shock therapy didn't really go into effect. It went into effect, as I mentioned Poland before, it went into effect in Poland, and it actually really worked. Shock therapy, although in name it happened in Russia, it didn't actually happen. A lot of the money was diverted, a lot of the things were shot down by the Kremlin, and so a lot of the government decisions were really based off of personal gains from the officials, and so they steered away from reform, and most money poured into wealthier areas instead of funding growth of undeveloped regions. So the money that did go into it wasn't actually helping the economy grow, but it was just pouring money into the already successful areas. So I mean, if we wanted to get the government started here, we just keep pouring it into Microsoft or something like that instead of actually helping other industries form. And then the main focus on natural resources sector, mostly energy, leaving the economy unbalanced, has been a big problem in Russia. They have a lot of natural resources. The country's so large that they're bound to, and yet they haven't really developed other industries, which have led them really dependent on the prices of natural gas. And so it's somewhat of a similar situation to Spain during the colonial era of really just exporting the gold, and instead of actually founding a solid base of an economy, just we're dependent on continually getting gold. And so it's kind of similar to this with Russia and natural gas.